when you look at that list and you put that on a global basis, you can get somewhat worried, because those factors that you see there, the overfishing, the overexploitation of resources of all varieties and the depletions, is now happening on a global scale. So that is what worries me. I think it's worrying more and more people, because we are, at the end of the day, all pretty dependent on globalised everything. The economy is global these days, and goods and services move around the planet very fluidly. My simple model of civilisation is a triangle where the basis is food. When we went back to the beginning of a pillar of civilisation being an agricultural system, you can't do much. You can't go out and create an economy without any food in your stomach. Ultimately, it's all about energy. All our energy comes from the sun. It gets translated through photosynthesis into food that we can eat. We go out and do our stuff, build economy, and build a culture and civilisation around that. So food is at the base of the pyramid, and I've heard various versions of this, the statement that we're only 9 meals away, I've heard it, only 7 meals away from anarchy. And there's probably more than a grain of truth in that. If you take away food availability, accessibility, affordability on a whole community or whole nation basis, you have serious problems. And we've actually seen that happen, that combination of environmental degradation, war, and climate changes, and total food deprivation in many of the failed states in Africa and other places. So that's my simple version. Food props up the economy, and once you've got food in your stomach and you can build an economic system, then you can build your culture around it as well. So take any one of those away and you've got trouble. Take food away, you've got real trouble. So, is this the end of civilization, as I've now described it, as we know it? My answer is, yeah, but we don't know what's going to change and what it's going to look like. So, it's not really an answer, is it? Hardly definitive, but it is an answer of sorts. The whole issue is uncertainty. We don't know how environmental impacts are going to, how quickly they're going to occur, how serious they're going to be. We don't know, although we're getting a pretty good idea of what the oil depletion curve is going to look like and the implications of that. And of course, along with all of these resource constraints and depletions is economics, is supply and demand. So probably one of the most early warning signals will be, as we've already seen some wild fluctuations up and down, certainly in stock markets, but in commodity prices and resource prices as well. And those things were partly, it has been suggested that the 2008, was it, very peak in oil and petrol prices was a big factor in the global financial crisis. Of course, that combined with mortgages put a lot of people in default on their mortgages. Slightly longer answer is, okay, if we're uncertain about what's going to happen, how do we plan for it? And Lee mentioned planning, and planning is important. In fact, it's what the transition movement ultimately is all about on a local scale. So what future can we plan for? Well, we can put all our faith in high tech, in technology, that technology will solve all our problems. We're going to build spaceships and go and colonise Mars and other places, or we'll come up with high-tech solutions. A bit more on that later. Or we can plan for this scenario, we're out of fuel, and we're back to an agrarian society where we're using the old dead cars as carts, the horses and that pulling around, provided the horses and ourselves have got something to eat, of course. So, but obviously, there's a lot in between those two. There are a couple of extremes. When faced with uncertainty, scenario planning is the obvious thing to do. You've got to think through all the possibilities of what might happen, create from that plausible scenarios, and you might get a dozen or 100 of different possible futures given a certain set of circumstances. And then, of course, you've got to whittle those down to the most likely, most plausible. And risk management was mentioned as well, and attach, what's the impact and what's the likelihood and the impact of these things happening, and come to some conclusions about then what you're going to do. And so scenario planning has been applied to this question of energy descent of peak oil and what's beyond that by certainly lots of people, but two that have influenced certainly the transition movement, particularly David Holmgren, who is one of the co-originators of permaculture, and a fellow called Glyn Davidson, who runs a Dynamic Cities project out of Vancouver. And I'm just going to touch briefly on each of those. Here are David Holmgren's scenarios, and I'll explain them a little bit as we go. On that graph you can see on the screen there, the vertical axis is a measure of the energy and resource use of population and pollution. It's a real composite of all those things. And the horizontal axis is time, way back from the beginning of agriculture, 10,000 years BP, through historical time up to the present, and then looking forward into future time. So it's saying we've peaked our population, we're getting close to the carrying capacity of the Earth with population. We've used resources on an increasing basis, and oil and other fossil fuels has been one of the major factors in our ability to grow the population of humans that we have on the planet. But what happens after that? Well, there's that spaceship one, is the one continuing to go up, which he calls the techno-explosion, where again we build the spaceships, we do all sorts of interesting things, and that solves our climate change and peak oil problems. The second one is a bit more moderate. It's called techno-stability, and that's a gentler decline, but it is a decline that's getting used to using less energy, but still using quite a bit of technology to get us through, and it's a fairly benign sort of scenario. The bottom one, of course, is collapse. The black line, which you can probably barely see, is a rapid diminishing of everything. David Holmgren also calls them brown tech for the techno-explosion one, because it involves a lot of, and if you look at the graph again, it involves more resource use, not less. It's now, okay, let's burn it up and spend it as fast as we can to get the technological solution. And things like nuclear, and things like clean coal and other things like that, and even more frightening, ideas like seeding the oceans so they'll grow masses of algae to suck up the CO2, or putting sulphur in the air so it'll reflect sunlight, and doing all of these sorts of things. They're at the mad science end of the techno-explosion story. Techno-stability is more, some restraint on population, use of renewable energies. It's probably the best we can hope for, and I think that's where governments would like to take us. Well, maybe good governments would aspire to take us. Then we've got what he calls Earth stewardship, where in fact we redefine progress. We accept an energy descent. We simplify reduce our energy usage. We reconfigure our cultures. And collapse, whichever way you look at it. Well, he calls it life pace. It's heading for the hills, every man in cells armed with their AK-47s to defend their stash of food. So take your pick. Back on this one, I was privileged to do a one-day seminar with David Holmgren on this issue of scenarios, and we were asked what we thought the possibilities were and what we thought government saw as the possibilities were. And the 7% on the top line, on the top one for techno-explosions, is what we thought as a group was the likelihood of that being the ultimate outcome. We thought less, but we thought government was putting about 40% of the expectation on that one. On the techno-stability, likewise, we thought it was less likely that governments were probably putting most of their eggs in that basket. or one of those two baskets. And then, obviously, the reverse. We thought that that the energy descent pathway was probably more likely than any of the others. And that could happen in not just one or the other. It could be some combination of these scenarios. So we could shoot for the stars with a techno explosion, but then hit the wall, go up at, have a red hot go at getting to Mars and fail, and having to stay on the planet as it gets sicker and sicker, and then having again another very steep decline accompanied by all the civilization chaos that goes with it. The green tech might precede stewardship in a series of more gentle declines as well. The answer is no one really knows. All you can do is try and think through scenarios. Very briefly, Bryn Davidson, and I'd recommend anyone to have a look at his site because he's done some very good analysis, a lot of material on his site as well, in looking at peak oil scenarios in particular, but also mixed with carbon, with climate change. So he uses slightly different terminology, and his vertical axis is whether we as a civilization are proactive or reactive in our response. And remember, one of those things about civilization collapse was a lack of response to environmental issues. So if he's saying if depletion is slow and the peak is not so early, we might pull off techno market or sustainable development. We might pull it off if the depletion is slow and the peak's not going to happen very quickly. If we don't respond and the depletion's fast, we could go very quickly into civilization collapse. And of course, again, there's everything in between. There's no certainty about any one. They're just ways of trying to grasp possibilities. So an opinion leading into the transition story is that, if you're left with uncertainty, the best way to predict the future is to create it yourself. And that's, I guess, a philosophical point of view that we come from. And now I'll describe the transition approach in 2 slides or less. What is the transition idea? Well, it's about taking action at the community level. It's about rallying people together, mobilising them, raising their awareness, such as what we're doing here, and Lee mentioned that's an important part of the process, and inviting them to rally around and get part of this, be part of a solution, create their own vision of what their community could be or needs to be in the future, and then start working on realising that vision by their own actions, and then ultimately by engaging with their local council. And I'd have to say, in the 18 months or so I've been involved in transition, I've really been very much encouraged by the actions of local councils. They get it, and they're getting on with it, big time. It's state and federal governments and international accords that just aren't getting it for one reason or another. Now, maybe they've got too many bills to pay and too many favours to pay as well. I don't know. That's the concern. But at local government level, it's working well. And the transition movement is about communities getting themselves mobilised and active and taking their ideas to local government and saying, let's work on this together. If I was to make one statement of political nature, I think we should have far fewer and much larger local governments in Sydney. We've got 41 local councils. We could do with maybe 6 or 7 good-sized councils. Brisbane has one, as you know. So what are the beliefs behind the transition approach? Well, I think I've alluded to that. Leave it to large governments and they won't do anything. They won't do enough. Individuals acting alone really can't because it's the numbers of them and resources they have. If we get together as communities, we just might pull it off. Effective community action can encourage and empower both citizens and local government. Another thing I've learned is that local governments can only work if their communities are together and active and feeding up community needs to. So I see it as like one hand down to the individual, one hand up to local government, bridging the gap. And at the end of the day, there's no guarantees. This is a 10, 20, 30-year project. It's an experiment that's in action now, with no guarantees it'll work. We might all burn out and lose energy in our local transition initiatives. We might not. But we're going to give it a red hot go because we see the importance of community action, meeting local government resources and pushing it up from there. So in conclusion, civilisation will change in ways we don't know. The best way to create the future is to predict the future is to create it, and action now is our response to the issue of peak oil and climate change. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, that was food for thought to such an extent that I don't remember whether I've had dinner or not. Now, our third speaker is Reverend the Honourable Dr. Gordon Moyes, MLC. Dr. Gordon Moyes is Parliamentary Leader of the Family First Party in the New South Wales Legislative Council. He is a prominent evangelist and broadcaster and one of Australia's most respected Christian leaders. He served for 27 years as Superintendent of the Wesley Mission Sydney, which is Australia's largest non-government welfare provider and the world's largest city-based church. Something to think about, isn't it? We're not the world's largest city, but we have the world's largest city-based church. He hosted the weekly TV program Turn Around Australia, remembered by most of you, and became a household name. He has been seen as a pro-environment MP and a regular speaker on sustainable farming practices and renewable water and energy resources. So welcome Reverend Gordon Moyes, please.
Thank you, David. As David said, I'm not a scientist, I'm a minister of religion. And I decided I'd retire when I reached 65 years after 50 years of ministry, and then I was asked to come into Parliament, and for the last 8 years I've been a colleague with Lee, and we find lots of commonality in the things we do. May I just say it's probably the best thing I've ever found as an antidote to Alzheimer's, being in Parliament. And one of the reasons for this is that if you look up Hansard, you'll see that most parliamentarians speak on about 25 or 30 topics every year. 35 topics every year, not counting questions that are prepared for them by their parties. Lee and I both speak somewhere between 400 and 500 topics per year. Now that means you're constantly researching, constantly reading. And we're able to call upon a lot of good people to help us. For example, every month here, I meet with a group of scientists from CSIRO, and they choose the topic, and we look in depth at what is happening in their particular field or for this particular month. And then also once a month, again in here, with the Australian Association of Professional Engineers, looking at what is the next big engineering challenge that we face, and we study those. And then over the years, at least the last 22 years, I've always kept a professional career going, quite apart from being a Minister of Religion. And for some 22 years now, I've been a member of the faculty of the University of North East Tennessee, the State University of Tennessee, and I'm an adjunct professor in the field of urban mission. That is how cities develop and grow, and the infrastructure that's required. And it's strange that you should mention this, but I've made quite a study over the last 20-odd years with my students who are all doing masters or doctorates on Detroit. And Detroit is it's the first major rust bucket city in the world. And if you're ever going to study what is going to happen to Sydney in the future, you start looking at Detroit. Now, I just leave that all to one side for the moment to speak on this subject, because I'm not a specialist in peak oil, but as Lee said, I joined her in trying to get the New South Wales Parliament to establish a program, and in particular looking at the future of peak oil. We started that about 3 years ago, I suppose, and over the years since we've tried to move people in that direction. She's got more hope of becoming a senator for New South Wales than she's got of moving the New South Wales Parliament towards considering peak oil seriously. But I don't mind. I often sit with Lee and we go down gloriously because it's better to stick with what you know is right and true and sensible and be unafraid of facts than it is to stay with prejudice and conservatism. If you harbour any doubts about the urgency of the issue of the topic tonight, let me quote to you the former United States Energy Secretary, Dr. James Schlesinger, who in 2006 stressed at the Association for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas in Ireland with this comment: "The peakists have won." To the peakists I say, you can declare victory. You are no longer the beleaguered small minority of voices crying in the wilderness. You have become mainstream. In other words, the issue of peak oil is no longer an issue that is up for debate. It is no longer controversial. It is no longer considered alarmist. It has been accepted as valid by scientists worldwide. The term peak oil was coined back in the 1950s by M.K. Hewitt to refer to a theoretical turning point. Now, that is the point where oil production from fossil fuels, oil production, begins to decline. It doesn't mean to say we've run out. It doesn't mean to say that we'll only now have very small supplies. But it does mean that from now on, we're actually declining in the amount of oil that we can pump from the earth. He correctly predicted that in US, the oil production, which was regarded as sort of a bottomless bowl of oil under the US, would peak between 1965 and 1970. And then after that, you might remember, America suddenly found itself in a huge crisis that had to do with the availability of gasoline. The Australian Petroleum Production Exploration Association reports that oil production in Australia peaked in the year 2000. In other words, it means every year after the year 2000, we have available to us less and less fossil fuel. Today, petroleum industry analysts predict that the global peak will occur any time now. Predictions have varied from year to year, but the fact is that everybody's agreed that global oil reserves, which we once thought were just bottomless in point of fact, have now reached the point of beginning to decline. Although peak oil doesn't technically mean we run out of the stuff altogether, it does mean that every year we can produce less than what we produced the year before. It's a finite resource. Now, Lee made the point that oil is used, petroleum products, in a vast amount of goods. Obviously, we think of gasoline, petrol, diesel, jet fuel, industrial oils. But if I had a scientist in this field here, he would amaze us going around. You couldn't produce the girders without oil. You couldn't produce the carpet. You couldn't produce the seats you're on. Your clothes are involved. The tablets you took this morning in pharmaceuticals, the drink you had at lunchtime, the food production, the bringing of agricultural products to market and distribution through the supermarkets. Everything that you can think of depends upon fossil fuel and oil. For example, all of our systems for producing food and distributing it into the community relies very heavily on oil, not only for fuel for farming, but for phosphates, for agrochemicals, the packaging, plastics, bottles, everything you can think of goes back to the way we depend upon oil. And we're becoming more and more vulnerable as the price of oil varies and as the supply diminishes. Robert Hirsch's report, quote, "Peaking the World Oil Production Impacts Mitigation and Risk Management," commissioned by the US Department of Energy, published in 2005, looks at the issue of peak oil, suggests mitigating actions and discusses the likely impacts based upon the timeliness of those actions. And I can say, if you just read the last chapter, you will say this is the end of civilization as we know it. Such mitigation will take much longer than a decade or two to come into effect because of the enormous scale of oil consumption. But he says unless mitigation is orchestrated on a timely basis, the economic damage to the world economy will be dire and long-lasting. There was a recent documentary film entitled The End of Suburbia. It highlights the fact that many Americans are oblivious to the fact that their lives are currently running on empty. I have been going to the US once, twice, sometimes more frequently every year since 1972. And I have looked back over the last 30 or 40 years, and it's quite amazing how gradually the awareness of this is coming upon the American community. Big cities always kept growing like donuts out further and further because they had plenty of land and they had concrete freeways that ran in every direction, and gas was cheap. A gallon of gas would cost 40 cents or 23 cents, the sort of stuff we just can't imagine. And so America was just built upon this incredible ability to move cheaply and easily. And then all of a sudden people began to realise that it's no longer going to be like that. And consequently there's a renewal now in the inner suburbans. The hollow donut city is being rebuilt from the centre out. There are mass migrations of people. Suburbia is dying. In one city that I know very well, Johnson City, where University of Tennessee is located, there are actually 5 cities which can be traced back from the middle of the 19th century as the city has grown further and further out. And now, of course, it's dead on the outside, not on the centre. And the renewal has come in there. And having gone to that same city for 30-odd years and meeting every time I go with the senior bureaucrats in the municipality and church planners and other people and looking at what's happening, it's a wonderful example of what's happening in the city. And that's true of Detroit also. President Bush, the father, in 1992 said, it doesn't matter what you say about peak oil, the American way of life is not negotiable. That way of life required a highly disproportionate use of the world's non-renewable resources, the mainstay of that way of life in suburban living. I mention this because Australia, apart from the United States of America, Australia is the most urbanised, living in suburbs country in the world. 86% of us live in 6 cities. And if I take a map of Australia, and they're just huddled around the coast, if I take a map of Australia and put my thumb over NSW, which stands for Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong, if I just cover that there, I've covered about 1 out of every 3 people in Australia. We're the most urbanised, suburbanised city in the world. And oil depletion means the collapse of that Australian dream of a quarter-acre block, of a house with some land that relies upon the car to take us to the shopping mall, to Westfield, to where we work, to where we live, to where our food comes from, and to where we sleep. That kind of future is rapidly coming to an end. Scientists have told us that since the 1950s, the world did have a limited amount of fossil fuel left. And there was an oil crisis in 1973 among all the industrialised nations. And there was petrol rationing, including here in Australia. In recent decades, we've repeatedly warned by environmentalists to use less energy. Some early adopters gave up their cars and turned to public transport. Most people in Western societies have ignored those warnings, and governments like the New South Wales government has decided that if you live in the southwest of Sydney or in the northwest of Sydney, you don't deserve public transport. And that's your own fault. And they have gone on as if we have unlimited supplies and every family has to have 2 cars in order to do basic family life. Some commentators wonder if we're experiencing collective denial by ignoring these warnings year after year. We need to act fast. The Western world needs to plan ahead. As part of that effort, New South Wales has to examine all of those issues concerning the futures, not only just the supply of oil and alternative forms of energy, but we have spoken many times about alternative forms of energy such as wind and solar and wave and tidal and biomass and green mass. And I think also we've got to look at electricity production through the use of geothermal heating. There are some very, very exciting possibilities of heating, superheating water underground, bringing it up, turning it into steam, moving turbines, and as the water cools, sending it straight back down again to be heated up. And there's no CO2 emissions, there is nothing else but the generation of electricity. We've got to bring it to Sydney from central western New South Wales, and that's a problem because we lose too much as we string immense high energy wires across the state, but that's an issue scientists have to work on. A number of states and cities have already taken this issue quite seriously. For example, in the county of San Francisco, California, there is a peak oil preparedness task force. They run very large public meetings like this, educating citizens about the issues. They have had, I know, sessions including what's happening with oil, growing food in the urban environment, creating communities and local economies, transportation, personal preparation, keeping healthy in a post-peak world, and so on. In my own life, I've sat with my wife and we've discussed ways in which we could be totally self-reliant in water, for example, and in electricity, for example, and in food production. We don't have anything that provides us with milk, but just about everything else we grow. We have our own vegetable gardens, we have our own